They thought she was alone. They thought she was weak. They thought an old woman and her dying dog would be easy to break. They were wrong. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, and if you want to support the channel, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. The Oregon coast in late spring carries a particular kind of beauty that feels almost apologetic, as if the land itself knows how rare these moments of peace are before summer tourists arrive or winter storms return. Willow Creek sat nestled between the Cascade foothills and the Pacific, a town of 3,200 souls connected to the outside world by a single winding highway that serpentined through Douglas fir forests so dense they swallowed sunlight. The town existed in that peculiar space of American geography where people came either to find themselves or to disappear entirely. Ethan Cross had come for the latter. The cabin he rented sat 2 miles outside town proper, accessed by a gravel road that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. The property owner, a retired fisherman now living with his daughter in Portland, had been happy to lease it for 3 months, no questions asked, cash upfront. The structure itself was modest, a single room with a sleeping loft, walls of weathered cedar that had turned silver with age, a wood stove that actually worked, and windows that looked out over a meadow gradually surrendering to wild blackberry and Scotch broom. It was perfect because it was temporary. Everything in Cross's life now was temporary. At 34, he carried himself with the economy of motion that marked men who'd spent years in places where wasted movement could mean death. 6'2", 205 pounds, sandy blonde hair maintained in a military cut despite being on leave, slate-gray eyes that never stopped cataloging exits and angles and potential threats even in the middle of nowhere, Oregon. A scar traced his left jawline, pale against skin that had seen too much sun in countries whose names he couldn't discuss. He wore civilian clothes now, jeans and a faded green Henley, but his posture remained military, spine straight, shoulders squared, hands always visible and never quite relaxed. He'd been here for 11 days and the routine was becoming familiar. Wake at 0500 despite no alarm, no formation, no mission brief waiting. Run 6 miles through the forest trails with Kodiak. Return. Make coffee. Force himself to sit still for 30 minutes. Work on the cabin, fixing things that didn't need fixing. Drive into town for supplies once every 3 days. Speak to no one beyond transactional necessities. Repeat. The doctors at Balboa Nasal Medical Center had used words like decompression, reintegration, processing. What they meant was that Kandahar had broken something inside him that couldn't be fixed with surgery, only time and distance. So here he was. Taking time, creating distance, waiting to feel like something other than a weapon someone had forgotten to unload. Kodiak made it bearable. The German Shepherd sat on the cabin's small porch, 95 pounds of muscle and focused intelligence, black and tan coat gleaming in the morning light. 4 years old, trained as a multi-purpose canine at Naval Special Warfare Development Group, 2 deployments with Cross in countries that officially they'd never visited. The dog wasn't a pet. Pets were creatures you kept for comfort and companionship. Kodiak was a partner, a brother in arms, a weapon with a heartbeat and loyalty that transcended any human understanding of devotion. The dog's amber eyes tracked a raven moving between trees, ears swiveling to catch sounds Cross's merely human hearing couldn't detect, but his body remained relaxed. No threats. Not here, not yet. Cross poured his second cup of coffee and stood in the doorway, watching fog burn off the meadow as morning sun gained strength. The air smelled of pine and salt carried inland from the ocean 5 miles west. Clean and uncomplicated. No dust, no cordite, no blood. This was supposed to be healing. He wasn't sure it was working. The drive into Willow Creek for supplies followed the same route he'd taken 4 times before. The gravel road connected to Highway 22. which curved through forest for 3 miles before the first houses appeared, scattered at first, then clustering tighter as the town proper emerged. Willow Creek's main street ran 6 blocks long, lined with buildings that dated from the 1920s and 30s, back when logging money had flowed and people had believed the boom would last forever. It hadn't, but the architecture remained, maintained with varying degrees of success. Cross parked his truck. A 10-year-old Ford Ranger he'd bought cash off Craigslist in Portland, in front of Mackenzie's General Store. Kodiak rode in the passenger seat, watching through the window as Cross went inside for basics. Coffee, bread, eggs, vegetables that would keep, chicken for Kodiak. The transaction took 4 minutes. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a name tag reading Dorothy, tried small talk. Cross responded with polite monosyllables that didn't encourage continuation. Outside, he loaded bags into the truck bed and was about to leave when Kodiak's posture changed. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. The dog's ears came forward, focused on something down the street. His body went rigid, not with aggression but with alert intensity. A low sound rumbled in his chest, barely audible, the canine equivalent of a question mark. Cross followed the dog's gaze, 2 blocks down, in front of a well-maintained craftsman-style house with a garden visible even from this distance. An elderly woman stood facing 2 men. Even at this range, the body language was wrong. The woman's posture was defensive, arms crossed, chin up. The men stood too close, violating personal space deliberately, using their size as intimidation. One of them gestured toward the garden, then toward the house, sharp movements that carried implicit threat. Cross watched for 15 seconds. The men wore work clothes but stood with the casual arrogance of people accustomed to getting their way through force. The woman didn't back down, but she also didn't have anywhere to go, trapped in her own front yard. Not his business, not his town, not his fight. Cross opened the truck door. Kodiak's eyes flicked to him, waiting for command, for purpose, for direction that would transform alert observation into action. Cross climbed into the truck and started the engine. The dog settled back into the seat, but his gaze remained locked on the distant confrontation. Ears still forward, bodies still carrying tension. They drove past slowly. The woman was Asian, late 60s or early 70s, dressed in gardening clothes, silver-streaked black hair pulled back. Her face carried the kind of dignified determination that comes from a lifetime of standing firm on principle. One of the men was talking, smiling, but it was the smile of a predator playing with food. The other stood with arms crossed, providing silent backup threat. Cross noted details automatically. The men's boots were expensive, too clean for actual laborers. The truck parked nearby was new, a white Ford F-250 with contractor logos on the door. But the logos were generic, corporate. The house behind the woman was immaculate, the garden even more so, bursting with late spring blooms and carefully tended beds that spoke. Oak of love and attention spanning years, he drove another block, then pulled over, sat there with the engine idling. Kodiak whined softly, a sound the dog almost never made. Cross looked at him. The shepherd's amber eyes held something that might have been reproach, or might have been hope, or might have been simply a reflection of Cross's own conscience refusing to stay silent. Not his business. He put the truck in gear and drove back to the cabin, following the winding highway through the forest that swallowed sound and light, back to the temporary sanctuary where he was supposed to be healing, supposed to be processing, supposed to be learning how to be something other than a weapon. The coffee tasted bitter that afternoon. The cabin felt smaller. Kodiak lay by the door instead of his usual spot by the stove, facing toward town, ears swiveling at sounds too distant for Cross to hear. That night, Cross didn't sleep well. He kept seeing the woman's face, the set of her shoulders, the way she'd stood her ground despite being outmatched and alone. Kept seeing the men's smiles, the casual cruelty of people who believed power insulated them from consequences. At 0300, he gave up on sleep and sat on the porch with lukewarm coffee, watching stars wheel overhead. Kodiak sat beside him, warm, solid presence in the dark. Not his business, not his town, not his fight. But somewhere in the distance, carried on wind that smelled of coming rain, he heard a dog barking. Not the territorial bark of an animal defending space, but something desperate, something wrong, something that spoke of distress and pain. Kodiak's head came up, his ears locked on the sound. The barking continued for 3 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt heavy, ominous, full of implications Cross didn't want to examine. He sat there until dawn touched the eastern sky, and told himself he'd probably imagined it. The Harborside Cafe sat at the intersection of Main Street and Ocean Avenue, a converted fisherman's supply store with wide windows that looked out over the town's small boat marina. Cross hadn't planned to go there, but on day 14 of his self-imposed exile, the cabin walls felt like they were closing in, and the silence had become oppressive rather than peaceful. He took a corner table with clear sightlines to both exits and the street outside. Kodiak lay beneath, invisible to casual observers, but positioned to move instantly if needed. The cafe smelled of coffee and frying bacon, morning conversations creating a low murmur of small-town familiarity where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noted immediately. Cross ordered coffee and eggs from a waitress in her late 20s, dark hair pulled back, intelligent eyes that lingered on him a moment longer than professional courtesy required. Her name tag read Elena. She brought his order efficiently and didn't attempt conversation beyond necessity, which he appreciated. He was halfway through breakfast when the door opened and the woman from 3 days ago entered. She moved slowly, careful in the way elderly people become when they've learned their bodies can betray them. Late 60s, Chinese American. Maybe 5'4", wearing a cardigan despite the mild morning temperature. But it was her face that stopped him. The dignified determination he'd seen before had been joined by something else now. Exhaustion, grief, the hollowed-out look of someone who'd lost something irreplaceable recently. She ordered tea at the counter, and when she turned, her gaze swept the cafe and landed on Cross. For a moment their eyes met. She nodded slightly. The acknowledgement of one stranger to another in a small town. Then she took a table by the window, alone, staring out at the street with tea growing cold in front of her. Kodiak's head emerged from under the table, the dog's eyes fixed on the woman with an intensity that made Cross look closer. The shepherd's ears came forward, and he made a sound deep in his throat, not quite a whine, not quite a growl. Something else, something that sounded almost like concern. Cross had learned over 4 years and 2 deployments to trust the dog's instincts about people. Kodiak could detect threat before it materialized, could sense ill intent in body language and chemical signals humans couldn't consciously process. But this wasn't his threat detection response. This was something different. The woman pulled a tissue from her purse and dabbed at her eyes, trying to be discreet, failing. Her hands shook slightly. Elena, the waitress, approached her table, refilled tea that hadn't been touched, and leaned down to murmur something. The older woman shook her head, managed a smile that didn't reach her eyes, said something brief. Elena squeezed her shoulder and walked away, but Cross saw the worry in her face. He should leave, should pay his bill, collect his dog, return to the cabin and the isolation that was supposed to be healing him. Should maintain the boundary between himself and a town that wasn't his, people who weren't his responsibility, problems that weren't his to solve. Kodiak stood up, a clear violation of his training to remain hidden and still. The dog took 2 steps toward the woman's table before Cross's quiet command stopped him. Blibe. The shepherd froze, but didn't return. His amber eyes shifted from the woman to Cross and back again. And in them was something that looked absurdly like pleading. The door opened again. 2 men entered, and Cross recognized them instantly from 3 days prior. The first was maybe 40, 6 feet tall, expensive casual clothes, moving with the entitled swagger of someone who'd never faced real consequences. The second was slightly shorter, younger, with cruel eyes and a mouth that naturally curved toward sneer. They spotted the woman immediately. Their approach wasn't subtle. They crossed the cafe like they owned it, stopping at her table without invitation. The first man smiled, warm and false as plastic. "Mrs. Chen, didn't expect to see you out and about after yesterday." The woman, Mrs. Chen, looked up. Her voice was soft but steady. "Mr. Finch, I'm having my tea." Of course, of course." The man, Finch, pulled out the chair across from her and sat uninvited. His companion remained standing, arms crossed, blocking her exit. Just wanted to check in. See how you're doing. Terrible thing about Rex. Mrs. Chen's hands tightened around her teacup. Yes, terrible. 14 years old, you said? That's a good long life for a dog. Finch's tone carried false sympathy that made Cross's jaw tighten. But you know how it is with old animals. They get into things they shouldn't. Eat something toxic. Nature takes its course. Rex never left my yard. Mrs. Chen's voice remained steady, but Cross heard the tremor beneath. He was too old to wander, too loyal. Well, accidents happen. The second man spoke for the first time, voice carrying ugly amusement. Especially in gardens. You use a lot of chemicals, don't you? Fertilizers, pesticides. Easy for an old dog to get confused. I use only organic methods. William and I never. Her voice cracked slightly on her husband's name. Right, William. Finch leaned forward, dropping the pretense of sympathy. Look, Margaret, I'm trying to help you here. You're alone in that big house. Gardens to maintain, property to manage. And now, after this tragedy, well, maybe it's time to reconsider Mr. Blackwell's very generous us offer. Fresh start somewhere easier, somewhere safer. The cafe had gone quiet. Other patrons watched with the uncomfortable awareness of witnesses who wouldn't intervene, who'd learned that in Willow Creek, crossing certain people carried consequences. Mrs. Chen set down her teacup with careful precision. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years managing classrooms of teenagers. I taught high school art for 3 decades, Mr. Finch. I know a bully when I see one. The answer remains no. That house is my home. Those gardens were my husband's passion. I will not abandon them because you and your employer think you can frighten an old woman. The second man's sneer deepened. You sure about that, Grandma? Because seems like things around your place are getting dangerous. Dead dogs today. Who knows what tomorrow? Cross's hand moved to the edge of the table. Kodiak's body tensed, waiting. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, to cross the 15 feet between tables and explain to these men exactly how dangerous things could get when you threatened the vulnerable. But Finch was already standing, smoothing his shirt. Think about it, Margaret. Really think hard. Accidents tend to cluster. Be a shame if something happened to that beautiful garden. Or worse. He smiled, cold and empty. Have a nice day. They left, the door chiming cheerfully behind them. Mrs. Chen sat frozen, tea cold, hands trembling now that the confrontation had passed. Elena appeared immediately, sliding into the chair Finch had vacated, speaking too quietly for Cross to hear. Mrs. Chen nodded, gathered her purse, allowed the younger woman to help her stand. As they passed Cross's table, Mrs. Chen's eyes met his again. In them he saw something that punched through every wall he'd built, not pleading, not asking for help, just recognition. The acknowledgement of another person seeing her, really seeing her, in a town that had learned to look away. Then she was gone, Elena supporting her elbow as they exited onto the street. Cross sat there, with cold coffee and an untouched half of breakfast, staring at nothing. Kodiak whined softly, the sound carrying reproach and confusion. The dog understood protect, understood pack, understood loyalty. He didn't understand why his handler was sitting still when Pack was threatened. Not his fight, not his town, not his responsibility. He paid in cash, left a generous tip, and walked out into morning sunshine that felt obscene, given what he'd just witnessed. Loaded Kodiak into the truck, started the engine, sat there with his hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. The logical move was to drive back to the cabin, mind his own business. He had 79 more days of medical leave. Then he'd return to Virginia Beach, to his team, to a world that made sense because the enemies were clear and the mission parameters were defined. This wasn't his world. These weren't his people. Except he kept seeing Mrs. Chen's hands trembling around that teacup, kept hearing the cruel amusement in that man's voice, kept feeling Kodiak's confusion about why they weren't acting. Cross pulled out of the parking space and drove, but not toward the cabin, toward the craftsman house with the immaculate gardens, following an instinct he couldn't name and wasn't sure he trusted. The property was easy to find. 2 blocks off Main Street, corner lot, distinctive for the explosion of color that was the front garden. Even from the street, Cross could see the care invested. roses in full bloom, beds of vegetables arranged with geometric precision, pathways of river stone, a small greenhouse in back. A memorial bench sat beneath a Japanese maple, brass plaque too distant to read, but purpose obvious. He parked across the street, uncertain what he was doing here, what he thought he could accomplish. That's when Kodiak went rigid. The dog's entire body locked, ears forward, focused on the garden. A low growl built in his chest, sustained and serious. His hackles rose. Cross followed the dog's gaze and saw it. In the vegetable beds, plants were wilting, not gradually, not from natural causes. They were collapsing as if poisoned, leaves turning brown and curling, stems drooping. And at the edge of the garden, barely visible in afternoon shadows, lay a shape. A dog, old, not moving. Cross was out of the truck before conscious thought finished processing. Cross moved fast but not recklessly, scanning the property for active threats before committing. Kodiak stayed at his heel, without command. Both of them falling into the tactical rhythm developed over years of high-threat operations. The front gate was open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Fresh tire tracks marked the driveway, too wide for a sedan, recent enough that edges hadn't dried. The dog lay near the greenhouse, an old border collie mix with a graying muzzle and the kind of gentle face that spoke of a lifetime of loyalty. His sides barely moved, shallow breaths, irregular, labored. Foam at the corners of his mouth. His eyes were open but unfocused, pupils dilated unevenly. Cross dropped to one knee beside him, fingers finding the pulse point on the animal's hind leg. Thready, erratic. The dog's gums were pale, almost white. Classic signs of poisoning, probably ingested within the last hour based on symptom progression. Kodiak sniffed carefully, keeping distance, then growled again. Not at the dying dog, but at something else. He moved toward the vegetable beds, nose working the air, and stopped at a section where tomato plants were collapsing. The shepherd pawed the ground once, then looked back at Cross with amber eyes that communicated clearly. Wrong, danger, poison. Cross followed and found it immediately. A small plastic container, half buried in mulch, commercial grade, the kind used for concentrated pesticides. The label had been deliberately removed, but residue remained on the rim. Greenish-blue crystals that caught sunlight. He pulled his phone, photographed it without touching, noted the position. 30 feet away, more containers. These were less carefully hidden, scattered along the fence line like someone had distributed them quickly. The plants nearest each container showed the same rapid die-off, chemical burn marching through living tissue. This wasn't accidental. This was methodical destruction disguised as carelessness. The back door of the house stood slightly ajar. Every tactical instinct screamed wrong. Cross moved to the door, Kodiak flanking, both of them using the training that had kept them alive in places where mistakes meant body bags. He listened. No sounds from inside. No movement. But the door frame showed fresh damage, once splintered near the lock, forced entry. He pushed it open with his boot, staying outside the fatal funnel, letting Kodiak's superior senses clear the immediate space. The shepherd entered low and fast, disappearing into what looked like a kitchen. 5 seconds. 10. Then Kodiak reappeared, body language signaling all clear, but wrong. Cross entered, every sense heightened, and understood immediately what the dog meant. The kitchen had been ransacked, but not robbed. Drawers pulled open, contents scattered, but the laptop on the counter remained. The television visible in the next room untouched. This was intimidation, not theft. Send a message. Make her feel violated, unsafe, powerless. In the living room, picture frames had been knocked from shelves. Photographs. Aths of Mrs. Chen and a man, presumably William, their life together documented in frozen moments. Wedding day, anniversaries, travel, garden work, smiling faces that spoke of decades of partnership. Several photos lay on the floor, glass shattered, grinding underfoot. On the wall, someone had spray-painted 2 words in harsh red. Last warning. Cross pulled out his phone and documented everything methodically. Photographs, angles, close-ups of the forced entry, the spray paint, the disturbed rooms. He moved through the house quickly, confirming it was empty, noting that only common areas had been vandalized. They hadn't gone upstairs, hadn't touched bedrooms. This wasn't about destruction. This was about fear. Back outside, the old dog's breathing had worsened. Minutes, maybe less. Cross made a decision. He scooped up the animal carefully, aware that movement might accelerate whatever poison was shutting down his system, but knowing that without intervention, death was certain. The dog barely responded, too far gone to register being moved. 60 pounds of dead weight, fur soft with age, collar worn smooth by years. Kodiak, such. The shepherd understood. Find more. He ranged through the garden systematically, nose working, and found 3 additional containers, each positioned near water sources or areas where an animal might naturally investigate. This wasn't random. Whoever did this understood the property, knew where a dog would go, where he'd be vulnerable. Cross loaded the dying animal into his truck's back seat, Kodiak jumping in to monitor, then collected the poison containers using a plastic bag from the kitchen, careful not to contaminate evidence. He was backing out of the driveway when a small sedan turned the corner. Mrs. Chen's face went from tired to horrified in the space between heartbeats. She was out of the car before it fully stopped, rushing toward her house, and Cross intercepted her halfway up the walk. She tried to go around him, surprisingly strong for her size, panic overriding caution. Mrs. Chen, stop. She looked up at him, and recognition flashed. The man from the cafe, the stranger with the watchful eyes and the military bearing, and the dog who'd seemed to sense her distress. My house, Rex. I heard him this morning. He was suffering, and I couldn't. I had to leave. I couldn't watch him. The words tumbled out, grief and guilt and fear mixing into incoherence. Your dog is in my truck. He's alive. Barely. We need to move now. She blinked. What? Veterinary clinic. Where? Ocean Avenue. 4 blocks. But Cross was already moving, guiding her toward his truck with a hand on her elbow that was gentle but allowed no argument. She saw Rex in the back seat. Kodiak pressed against him, somehow understanding his role as guardian for a fallen brother. Mrs. Chen made a sound that was half sob, half prayer. Get in. She did. Cross drove with controlled urgency, not reckless, but fast, running one red light at an intersection he'd already cleared visually. Mrs. Chen held her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming silently. The veterinary clinic was small, family-run, and the receptionist took one look at Cross carrying the limp dog and called for the vet immediately. Dr. Sarah Matthews was 40, competent, and asked the right questions while already working, checking vitals, inserting an IV line, administering activated charcoal. What was he exposed to? Cross produced his phone, showed the photos of the containers. Dr. Matthews's face darkened. That's industrial-grade herbicide, lethal to animals even in small doses. How long ago? Unknown. Found him maybe 20 minutes ago. Symptoms suggest longer exposure. The vet worked quickly, professionally, but Cross saw the assessment in her eyes. Long odds, very long. Mrs. Chen stood to the side, small and shaking, watching her companion of 14 years fight for breaths. Cross moved to her, spoke quietly. What happened this morning? She didn't look away from Rex. I found him in the garden around 7, barely moving, foam at his mouth. I didn't know what to do. I called the clinic, but they said bring him in immediately. And I tried, but he's so heavy, I couldn't lift him, couldn't get him to the car. Her voice broke completely. So I came to find help, and when I came back, your house was broken into. They destroyed your garden, left a message. Now she looked at him, eyes widening. How do you? I was there, saw your dog, checked the house, collected evidence. He pulled out the bagged containers. These were scattered throughout your property, deliberately placed where an animal would find them. Mrs. Chen's face shifted through emotions, grief, anger, and something harder, resolution. Blackwell. Who is Blackwell? Harrison Blackwell, developer, wants my property, has wanted it for 18 months, made offers, then threats. Then, she gestured helplessly at Rex, fighting for life on a steel table, while a vet worked with grim determination. This. The men from the cafe. They work for him? Garrett and Cole Finch, brothers. Everyone knows they're his enforcers. But the sheriff does nothing. The deputies do nothing. Because Blackwell owns them too. Owns half this town. Cross watched her face, saw no deception, no exaggeration. Just exhausted truth from someone who'd been fighting alone too long. Your husband, he said carefully. William. When did he pass? 14 months ago. Cancer. Her voice softened saying his name. We were married 42 years. He built those gardens, Every plant, every stone, every pathway, his hands, his heart. It was our dream. And now they're destroying it because I won't sell them our dream. Dr. Matthews looked up. He's stable, barely. Next 12 hours will tell. The amount of poison in his system should have killed him an hour ago. He's a fighter. Mrs. Chen moved to the table, placed one weathered hand on Rex's head. The dog's eyes fluttered, focusing briefly. Recognizing his person, his tail moved once, barely a twitch. Then he slipped back into unconsciousness. Cross stepped outside into late afternoon sun, pulled out his phone, and made a call to a number he'd hoped not to use during leave. It rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered. Cross, everything okay? Need a favor, Chief. Background check. Harrison Blackwell, Willow Creek, Oregon, developer, and 2 contractors, Garrett and Cole Finch. Anything federal. A pause. You supposed to be decompressing. I am. This is separate. Another pause, longer. Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Rivera had served with Cross for 6 years, knew him well enough to hear what wasn't being said. How separate? Very, for now. Send me details, I'll run it quiet. Cross disconnected and stood there in parking lot gravel, watching Kodiak through the truck window. The shepherd stared back. And in his amber eyes was something that might have been approval, or might have been relief, or might have been simply acknowledgement that his handler had finally done what they both knew was right. Mrs. Chen emerged 10 minutes later, eyes red, but composed. Dr. Matthews says I can stay with him tonight. She has a cot. Good. Cross handed her a piece of paper with his number written in precise military print. Anything happens, anyone comes, you call. She looked at the number, then at him. I don't even know your name. Ethan Cross. Why are you helping me, Mr. Cross? He considered several answers. Because he'd been trained to protect. Because injustice offended something fundamental in his wiring. Because a dog had looked at him with reproach for considering inaction. What he said was simpler. Because I can. She studied his face for a long moment, and whatever she saw there made her nod slowly. Thank you. Cross drove back to Mrs. Chen's house as dusk gathered. He cleared the property room by room, checked all entry points, documented everything with methodical precision. Then he did something that would have violated a dozen departmental policies if he'd still been active duty operating domestically. He stayed, set up Overwatch in his truck, parked with clear sightlines to the house and street. Kodiak in the passenger seat, alert and focused. They'd done this before in different countries, different contexts, same purpose. Protect the vulnerable, deter the predators. Around midnight, a white F-250 drove past slowly, the same truck from outside the cafe. It paused at the property, and Cross saw faces illuminated by dashboard lights. 2 men, watching, assessing. Then it continued on. Kodiak growled low. Cross placed a hand on his neck, feeling the tension in powerful muscles. I know, brother. Soon. The truck didn't return that night, but Cross knew it would, because men like the Finch brothers operated on patterns of escalation. They'd destroyed property. They'd killed a pet. Next would come something worse, something designed to break Mrs. Chen's resolve completely, unless someone stopped them. Cross watched the house through the night, drinking cold coffee, mind already working through tactical assessments and response options. He'd come to Oregon to decompress, to process trauma, to learn how to be something other than a weapon. But sometimes the world needed weapons. Sometimes peace required the capacity for controlled violence. Sometimes the only thing that stopped evil men was a better man willing to meet force with superior force. They'd picked the wrong person to terrorize. They just didn't know it yet. Cross spent the next morning transforming Mrs. Chen's property into a defensible position. Not overtly, nothing that would signal military preparation to casual observation, but anyone with tactical training would recognize the pattern. Motion sensor lights repositioned to eliminate blind spots, window locks reinforced, sightlines cleared by pruning branches that provided concealment for approach. The damaged back door replaced with a solid core unit and deadbolt he purchased with cash at the hardware store. Mrs. Chen returned at noon with cautiously optimistic news. Rex had survived the night, still critical but stable. The vet was amazed he'd held on this long, called it miraculous. Mrs. Chen called it stubbornness, and when she said it, Cross saw the steel beneath her gentle exterior. She hadn't broken, wouldn't break. She watched him work for several minutes before speaking. You're preparing for them to come back. Yes. You think they will? Cross set down the drill, met her eyes. I know they will. Men like that operate on escalation. They've invested time and effort. They won't stop because one old dog survived. She flinched at the bluntness, but didn't look away. What do you think they'll do next? Depends on how desperate Blackwell is, how much he wants this property, how untouchable he believes himself to be. Very untouchable. Mrs. Chen moved to the memorial bench, sat carefully, her fingers tracing the brass plaque. William Chen, beloved husband, master gardener, good man. She looked up. My husband researched Blackwell when the offers started, found articles about 3 other coastal developments. Each time there was a holdout property owner. Each time that owner eventually sold. 2 of them left town immediately after. One died in a house fire 6 months later. Electrical fault, they said. Cross went very still. You're telling me Blackwell has a pattern? I'm telling you everyone in Willow Creek knows Harrison Blackwell gets what he wants, and that people who resist him have accidents. She paused. William wanted to fight. Then he got sick, and fighting seemed less important than time together. After he passed, Blackwell waited exactly 2 months before making the first offer. Like he'd marked a calendar. You reported any of this? Federal authorities? And tell them what? That I suspect a respected businessman based on articles and rumors? That I feel threatened? Sheriff Dunmore made it very clear that property disputes are civil matters. Her voice carried bitter knowledge. The sheriff plays golf with Blackwell every Thursday. Cross pulled out his phone, checked for the message he'd been expecting. It was there. Chief Rivera had come through. Harrison Blackwell, 52, CEO of Blackwell Development Corporation. Net worth approximately $40 million. 3 previous developments along Oregon coast, all successful, all controversial. No criminal record, but 2 civil suits from former property owners alleging intimidation and fraud. Both settled out of court with NDAs. Garrett Finch, 38, and Cole Finch, 35, employed as contractors through a shell company Blackwell controls. Garrett has 2 assault charges from Idaho, pled down to misdemeanors. Cole has 1 assault, 1 animal cruelty charge that was dismissed. Mrs. Chen's face hardened at the last part. Animal cruelty. Dismissed doesn't mean innocent. Means someone made it go away. Cross scrolled further. There's more. Deputy Marcus Webb, 41, Willow Creek Sheriff's Department. Purchased a new boat last year, $40,000, on a salary of $52,000 annually. Mortgage paid off on a property assessed at $300,000. Financial pattern suggests secondary income not reported. Blackwell owns him. Blackwell owns enough of him. Cross pocketed the phone. But here's what matters. No federal charges, no active investigations. Everything stays local, where Blackwell controls the narrative. Mrs. Chen stood, moved to where her vegetable garden lay in ruins, plants withered and dying. 14 years of careful cultivation destroyed in a morning. So there's nothing to be done. He wins because the system is designed to let men like him win. I didn't say that. She turned, and in her eyes was the first spark of hope Cross had seen. What are you saying? I'm saying the system moves slowly. I don't. He gestured to the property. You're secure here for now, but you can't stay. Not until this is resolved. This is my home. This is a target, and you're vulnerable alone. Then I'll get a gun. I'll learn to shoot. Mrs. Chen. Cross kept his voice gentle but firm. With respect, that's not the answer. You'd be reacting. We need to act. We? She studied him with an intensity that reminded Cross of officers evaluating subordinates. You've been here 3 days in my life. You owe me nothing. Why are you doing this? It was the second time she'd asked essentially the same question, and Cross still didn't have an answer that felt complete. Because he'd been trained for this. Because evil unchecked spreads. Because a dog had looked at him with reproach, and he'd discovered he couldn't live with that reflection. What he said was, because it's right. She watched him for another long moment, then nodded slowly, accepting. What do we do? You stay with someone you trust. Somewhere Blackwell's people won't look. I need 48. You get an hours. To do what? Gather evidence, build a case, make contact with people who aren't on Blackwell's payroll. And if they come here while I'm gone. Cross smiled, and it wasn't a friendly expression. Then they'll find me instead. Across town, in an office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Pacific, Harrison Blackwell stood behind a desk of imported walnut, and listened to Garrett Finch explain why an elderly widow and her dying dog were still a problem. Blackwell was a man who'd learned early that wealth bought not just comfort but immunity. 52 years old, 6 feet tall, maintaining his athletic build through a personal trainer and vanity. Silver threading distinguished patterns through dark hair he paid $200 to cut every 3 weeks. He wore casual elegance today. Linen shirt open at the collar, expensive watch catching light. Every detail curated to project success and control. She wasn't at the house when we went back, Garrett was saying, standing with the awkward posture of a large man uncomfortable in refined surroundings. Neighbor said she'd been at the vet all night with the dog. The dog that should be dead. Should be, yeah. We used enough to drop a horse. Tough old bastard. Blackwell moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching waves break against rocks 200 feet below. His property, his view, his domain. This is taking too long, Garrett. I have investors asking questions. I have permits pending. I have a timeline that doesn't accommodate a sentimental widow clinging to a house she can't maintain. We can push harder. Cole's ready to. Cole is an idiot who'd burn the house with her in it if you didn't supervise. Blackwell turned, cold blue eyes fixing on Garrett with the intensity of a man accustomed to being obeyed. I need her gone. Not arrested, not martyred. Not turned into some cause, just gone. Broken enough that she takes the next offer and disappears. We can do that. You said that 3 months ago. She's still there. Garrett shifted, and Blackwell saw the flash of something dangerous in the larger man's eyes. Garrett Finch was useful because he was violent and controllable. But there were limits. Pushed too hard and even loyal dogs bit. There's one more thing, Garrett said. Someone else was at her property yesterday. Truck was parked there all night. Big guy, military look, had a German shepherd. Blackwell went very still. Military. That's the read. Cole ran the plates. Registered to an Ethan Cross, Virginia address. We made some calls. He's renting the Halverson cabin outside town. Background? Working on it. But boss, if he's military and he's involving himself, we need to know what we're dealing with. Blackwell returned to his desk, opened a laptop, began typing. He had resources. Connections. People who owed him favors in useful places. It took 7 minutes to get a preliminary report, and what he read made him reconsider his approach. Ethan Cross, 34, United States Navy, current status medical leave. No specific unit listed, but the fact that they're not listing it tells me exactly what unit. He looked up. He's special operations, probably a SEAL. Garrett's expression shifted from confidence to calculation. That's a problem. That's a complication. There's a difference. Blackwell closed the laptop. He's on leave, which means he's here temporarily. He has no authority, no jurisdiction, no reason to involve himself beyond playing hero. And heroes are predictable. They follow rules. They believe in systems. What do you want us to do? Blackwell considered his options. Direct confrontation with a trained operator was foolish. But there were other pressures, other angles. Everyone had vulnerabilities. Things they cared about, lines they wouldn't cross. Nothing yet. Watch him, learn his patterns, but don't engage unless he forces it. Blackwell smiled, the expression cold and calculated. Meanwhile, I'll make some calls. If Mr. Cross is on medical leave, his command should know he's inserting himself into civilian matters. That tends to complicate career trajectories. And the Chen woman? Give her 48 hours to think about her dead garden and dying dog. Let fear work for us. Then we revisit the offer. One final time. With clarity about what refusal means. After Garrett left, Blackwell stood at his window again, watching his domain. He'd built an empire through understanding leverage and pressure points, through knowing when to buy and when to break. Willow Creek was his town now. Every business on Main Street paid rent to his properties. The sheriff owed his election to Blackwell's funding. The town council voted how he suggested because he controlled their economic future. One elderly woman and one temporarily heroic soldier wouldn't change that. Couldn't change that. He picked up his phone and made a call to a contact at Naval Special Warfare Command, a captain who'd served with Blackwell's late father, who owed the family name consideration. The conversation was brief, professional, concerned. Just a courtesy call about one of their men possibly experiencing difficulties during medical leave, displaying concerning behavior, perhaps requiring evaluation. The seed planted, Blackwell disconnected and allowed himself a satisfied smile. Cross knew they were watching. He'd spotted the surveillance within 4 hours of establishing security at Mrs. Chen's property. A sedan with 2 occupants, parked 3 blocks away with clear sightline to the house. They rotated every 6 hours, professional enough to maintain distance, sloppy enough that someone with Cross's training made them immediately. He didn't acknowledge their presence. Instead, he continued preparations methodically, visibly, making sure they saw him working, saw Kodiak patrolling, saw that Mrs. Chen's property now had a guardian who moved with military precision and purpose. Let them watch. Let them report back. Let Blackwell understand the equation had changed. Elena Vasquez appeared at dusk, knocking on the front door with the tentative uncertainty of someone entering a situation they didn't fully understand. Cross opened it, Kodiak at his side, and she raised both hands in universal gesture of non-threat. "I'm a friend, Elena, from the cafe. I remember. Can I come in? I have information you need." Cross stepped aside, let her enter, watched as she took in the reinforced door, the repositioned furniture creating better sightlines, the tactical preparation evident to anyone paying attention. She was 29, Cross estimated, dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, carrying herself with the controlled energy of someone used to asking dangerous questions. "You're the one helping Maggie," she said. Statement, not question. "Yes. Good, because she needs it. And because I've been trying to build a case against Blackwell for 18 months with no success." She pulled a laptop from her bag, opened it on the kitchen table. "I'm an investigative journalist. Freelance mostly. I've been documenting Blackwell's pattern. Every property he's targeted, every holdout who eventually sold, every suspicious incident that cleared his path." Cross leaned over the laptop, scanning files. Property records, photographs, timeline documentation, interviews with former residents who'd left Willow Creek after selling to Blackwell. The work was thorough, obsessive, the kind of deep investigation. "Why hasn't this been published?" "Because my editor says it's not enough. Correlation isn't causation. Suspicious isn't proof. Without hard evidence of criminal activity, it's just conspiracy theory that gets us sued into bankruptcy." She looked up at him. "But you're military, special forces, if the rumors are right. You have resources I don't. Contacts, ways of getting information. And you think I can prove what you hadn't? I think between your skills and my research, we might actually have a chance." She pulled up another file, photographs of the Finch brothers, financial records. "I know Garrett and Cole are on Blackwell's payroll, through shell companies. I know Deputy Webb has unexplained income. I know 2 previous holdouts died in accidents that were investigated by the same sheriff's department that's compromised. What I can't prove is direct connection. Can't get testimony. Everyone's too scared." Cross studied the files, mind already sorting information, identifying patterns, seeing the shape of conspiracy that stayed just inside legal boundaries while destroying lives. It was sophisticated, careful, the kind of operation run by someone intelligent enough to insulate himself from direct culpability. "I'll need copies of everything." Elena smiled, relieved. "I've got a drive ready. Figured you'd say yes." "Why?" "Because Maggie Chen is the kindest person I know. Because she helped me when I first moved here and had nothing. Because watching Blackwell terrorize her makes me physically sick." She paused. "And because you're the first person who's looked at this situation and decided to do something instead of looking away." She handed him the flash drive, and in that exchange, Cross understood they'd formed an alliance. The operator, the journalist, and the widow. Not the coalition anyone would have chosen, but the one circumstances had forged. After Elena left, Cross uploaded her files, cross-referenced them with Rivera's information, and began building a tactical picture. Not of a battlefield, but of a conspiracy. Not of enemy combatants, but of corrupt civilians exploiting broken systems. It was different warfare, but warfare nonetheless, and Ethan Cross had been trained by the best military in the world to win wars. Kodiak rested his head on Cross's knee, amber eyes reflecting laptop light, patient and trusting. Cross scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling the familiar comfort of partnership, of purpose, of mission clarity. They'd come to Oregon seeking peace. Instead, they'd found a different kind of battle. But this time, They weren't fighting for ground or objectives or national interests. This time, they were fighting for something simpler and somehow more important. They were fighting for home, for an old woman's right to live in peace, for justice in a town that had forgotten what the word meant. And they were going to win. They came on the second night, at 02:30, when most people sleep deepest and response times are slowest. Cross had been expecting them, had planned for them, had positioned himself and Kodiak in the darkened living room, with clear sightlines to all approaches and the tactical advantage of defensive position against attackers operating in unfamiliar terrain. The surveillance sedan had departed at midnight, replacement never arriving. That told Cross everything. When your watchers stop watching, it means they already know what's coming next. Kodiak detected them first. The shepherd's ears swiveled toward the back of the property, body going rigid in the alert posture Cross had learned to read like language. Low growl, barely audible, vibrating through the dog's chest. Someone approaching. Multiple contacts. Attempting stealth. Cross moved to the window, staying in shadows, using night vision monocular he'd retrieved from his tactical kit at the cabin. 3 figures, moving through the darkness toward the house. 2 large, 1 medium build. The Cinch brothers and someone else. They wore dark clothes, faces covered, carrying objects Cross identified immediately as accelerant containers and crowbars. Not here to intimidate anymore. Here to destroy. Cross felt something cold and focused settle into his chest. The combat calm that had kept him alive through 2 deployments. Time seemed to slow, details sharpening to crystal clarity. He noted their approach vector, spacing between them. The way Cole Finch moved with aggressive confidence, while Garrett hung back slightly, more cautious, possibly armed. They reached the back door. Cole tested the handle, found it locked, gestured to the third man. That one produced the crowbar, positioned to force entry. Cross opened the door first. The sudden light from inside froze all 3 men in temporary confusion. Night-adapted eyes, struggling with the brightness. Cross stood in the doorway, backlit, hands visible and empty, Kodiak beside him, radiating controlled menace. "Gentlemen," his voice was conversational, almost pleasant. "You're trespassing. Leave now." Cole Finch recovered first, his face twisting into a sneer behind the bandana he wore. "Who the hell are you supposed to be? Her bodyguard? Last chance. Leave. Or what?" Cole took the step forward, crowbar swinging casually. "You gonna fight all 3 of us, tough guy? You and your mutt?" Garrett's voice cut through his brother's bravado. "Cole, wait. Look at him." Cole glanced at his brother, irritated. "What? Look at how he's standing. Look at the dog. That's military." "I don't care if he's..." Cross moved. 3 steps, closing distance before Cole could complete his thought. His right hand shot out, grabbed the crowbar mid-swing, twisted with precise application of leverage that turned Cole's own momentum against him. The weapon clattered to the ground. Cross's left hand struck Cole's solar plexus, calculated force that dropped the younger Finch to his knees, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The third man rushed forward. Cross sidestepped, used the attacker's momentum to guide him face first into the doorframe. Cartilage crunched. The man went down, hands covering his shattered nose, blood streaming between fingers. Garrett Finch stood frozen for 2 seconds, processing how quickly his advantage had evaporated. Then his hand moved toward his waistband. Fast, Kodiak launched like a missile, 95 pounds of trained aggression, covering 12 feet in under a second. The shepherd's jaws clamped onto Garrett's right forearm before the gun cleared his belt, bearing him backward to the ground. Garrett screamed. Kodiak held, applying pressure that communicated absolute dominance without causing permanent damage, waiting for command. Cross retrieved the weapon. A 9mm Glock, cleared it with practiced efficiency, pocketed the magazine. Then he crouched beside Garrett, who'd gone merry still beneath Kodiak's weight, feeling those jaws on his arm, and understanding how quickly they could crush bone. Ouse. Kodiak released immediately, backing off 3 steps, but remaining coiled, ready to re-engage on command. Garrett clutched his arm. Teeth marks, visible through torn sleeve. No blood, but already bruising. Cross kept his voice level, almost gentle. "You came here to burn this house, with evidence of arson, with weapons, with intent to commit felony property destruction, and potential murder if Mrs. Chen had been here. You're insane, Garrett gasped. We were just... Cross held up his phone, showing the recording that had been running since he'd detected their approach. Everything documented, video, audio, all three of you with faces covered, carrying accelerants and tools, attempting forced entry. That's conspiracy to commit arson, 5 to 10 years. Cole had recovered enough to speak, still on his knees. You can't prove nothing, our word against yours. Your word. Cross smiled without humor. 3 men with criminal records caught in the act versus decorated military veteran defending property. Which story you think plays better? The third man groaned, still holding his face. Garrett stared at Cross with dawning comprehension mixing with fear. Here's what happens next. Cross continued. You're going to answer questions, truthfully. Every lie, my partner here gets another command. He speaks German, understands 5 ACAC words. We've only used 1. You want to discover the other 4? Kodiak growled on cue, and Garrett flinched. Who sent you? You know who. Say the name. Garrett hesitated. Cross nodded fractionally. Kodiak took 1 step forward. Blackwell. Harrison Blackwell. Jesus, call off your dog. What were your orders? Burn the house. Make it look electrical. He said the old woman would be staying at the vet's office with her dog. Said the house would be empty. Said to make sure nothing was salvageable. How much did he pay you? 10,000. 5 now, 5 after. Cross pulled out his phone, dialed a number from memory. It rang 4 times before a sleep-roughened voice answered. This better be important, Cross. Chief, need another favor. Contact at FBI Portland Field Office. Someone who handles domestic terrorism and arson conspiracy. Rivera's voice sharpened, sleep vanishing. What did you do? Stopped a felony in progress. Have 3 suspects in custody, documented evidence, and recorded confession implicating a murder-for-hire conspiracy. Cross paused. Might need federal intervention. Local law enforcement is compromised. Jesus Christ, you were supposed to be decompressing. I'm very relaxed, Chief. Can you make the call? A long sigh. Give me 20 minutes. Keep those suspects secured and don't do anything else that's going to generate paperwork. Cross disconnected, looked at the 3 men. FBI is coming. You cooperate fully. Maybe you avoid maximum sentences. You lie, you protect Blackwell. You go down for everything while he walks. Your choice. Cole spat blood. Blackwell will bury you. You have no idea who you're messing with. Actually, I do. Harrison Blackwell, 52, CEO of Blackwell Development Corporation, net worth $40 million, history of intimidating property owners through escalating violence while maintaining legal deniability. 3 previous developments. 2 suspicious deaths connected to holdout owners, pattern of bribing local law enforcement. Cross rattled off the information with clinical precision. I know exactly who I'm messing with. Question is whether he knows who he's messing with. Garrett laughed, bitter and defeated. You think taking us down stops anything? He'll just hire new people. He always does. And he's got the sheriff, half the town council, lawyers who'll tie this up for years. You won a battle, soldier boy. He owns the war. Cross's phone buzzed. Text from Chief Rivera with a name and number. Special Agent Sarah McKenzie, FBI Portland. Already briefed, en route, ETA 90 minutes. Maybe, Cross said. But wars are won 1 battle at a time, and you just gave me ammunition. He zip-tied all 3 men using restraints from his tactical kit, positioned them in the living room with Kodiak on guard, then photographed everything. The accelerant containers, the crowbar, the weapons, their faces, built a documentation chain that would survive legal scrutiny. He'd done this before in different contexts, securing enemy combatants and material for intelligence exploitation. Same principles applied. At 0400, headlights appeared on the street. Not the FBI, too soon. A sheriff's department cruiser, rolling slow, spotlight sweeping the property. It stopped at the curb. Deputy Marcus Wedd emerged, hand resting on his service weapon. Moving with the false confidence of someone who believed his authority was absolute. Cross met him at the gate, Kodiak at heel. Webb's eyes widened slightly seeing the dog, then hardened. Got a call about a disturbance. Need to check the property. From who? That's not your concern. Step aside. No. Webb's hand moved closer to his weapon. I'm not asking. I'm a law enforcement officer investigating a complaint. You're interfering. Cross didn't move. There's no complaint. There's 3 men currently restrained inside who attempted arson. Federal authorities have been contacted and are en route. Your jurisdiction ended when this became a federal case. Federal? Webb's face flushed. You can't just. I already did. FBI will be here in about 70 minutes. You're welcome to wait. Explain to them why you're here at 0400, responding to a complaint that doesn't exist about a crime you should have been preventing. Cross paused. Or you can leave now, before your connection to Blackwell becomes part of a federal investigation into conspiracy and corruption. Webb stood there, trapped between orders from Blackwell and a sudden realization that the situation had escalated beyond local control. Cross saw the calculation in his eyes, the understanding that federal scrutiny would expose financial irregularities that would end his career at minimum, possibly his freedom. This isn't over, Webb finally said, backing toward his cruiser. Yes, Deputy, it is. The cruiser's taillights disappeared into darkness. Cross returned to the house, checked on his captives, and settled in to wait for federal authority to arrive and transform his tactical victory into legal consequences that would reach all the way to Harrison Blackwell. Garrett watched him with something between respect and fear. You really think you can take him down? Blackwell's been doing this for 20 years. He's got systems, protections, people who owe him everything. Everyone has vulnerabilities. Everyone makes mistakes. Your mistake was coming here tonight. His mistake was sending you. Cross met Garrett's eyes, and the biggest mistake was thinking an old woman was too weak to defend, too isolated to matter, too powerless to have someone stand up for her. Why do you even care? She's nobody. This isn't your town, not your fight. Cross thought about that question, the same one Mrs. Chen and Elena had asked, the one he'd been asking himself since he'd first seen those men threatening her in her own garden. Why did he care? Why get involved? Why risk the peace he'd come here seeking? The answer was simpler than he'd expected. Because I can. Special Agent Mackenzie arrived at 0545 with 2 other agents and a forensic team. She was 40, experienced, carrying herself with the confident authority of someone who'd seen too many cases like this and learned to trust evidence over explanations. Cross walked her through everything systematically. Timeline, documentation, recorded confession, evidence of accelerants and weapons, connection to larger conspiracy. She listened without interruption, took possession of suspects and evidence, and when Cross finished, studied him with professional assessment. You're military. Navy, currently on medical leave. Special, SEAL operations. Yes, ma'am. You understand you just inserted yourself into what's probably going to be a complex federal investigation into corruption, conspiracy, and multiple potential homicides? Yes, ma'am. You also understand that your actions tonight, while likely preventing a serious crime, put you in legal gray area regarding citizens' arrest, use of force, and detention? I understand. I'm prepared to face whatever legal review is necessary. Mackenzie's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Relax, petty officer. I'm not here to jam you up. You did good work tonight. Probably saved a life, definitely prevented arson, and handed us a conspiracy case with documented evidence and confession. She paused. But you need to step back now. Let us handle this through proper channels. No more solo operations. Clear? Clear. Where's the property owner? Safe location. I can contact her. Do that. We'll need her statement, but tell her she can come home. We'll have a protective detail here while we build the case. As dawn broke over Willow Creek, Cross stood in Mrs. Chen's garden, now a crime scene with federal agents photographing evidence and documenting everything. Kodiak sat beside him, tired but alert, having done his job perfectly, having protected and served exactly as he'd been trained. Cross called Mrs. Chen, told her it was safe, told her justice was finally moving. Heard her sob with relief and exhaustion, and something that might have been hope. Across town, in his glass and steel mansion overlooking the Pacific, Harrison Blackwell received a phone call from his lawyer informing him that federal agents were requesting his presence for questioning regarding conspiracy to commit arson, witness intimidation, and potential connection to 2 suspicious deaths under previous investigations. The town was waking to the news that 3 men had been arrested, that FBI had descended on quiet Willow Creek, that the untouchable Harrison Blackwell was suddenly very touchable. And at the center of it all, a Navy SEAL who'd come seeking peace and instead had found a different kind of mission. One that wasn't over yet. Harrison Blackwell didn't panic. Men who'd built empires through calculated ruthlessness didn't panic when pressure arrived. They adapted, they maneuvered. They used the same systems that threatened them as weapons for defense. He'd spent 20 years insulating himself from direct culpability, building layers between intention and action, ensuring that even when subordinates failed, the failure never traced back to him. The SBI's request for questioning was inconvenient, not catastrophic. His lawyer, Marcus Hyland, sat across from him in the study of his clifftop mansion, reviewing strategy with the dispassionate efficiency that justified his $500 hourly rate. They have the Finch brothers on arson conspiracy. They have Deputy Webb under financial investigation. They're building a pattern case connecting you to intimidation and possibly accessory to previous suspicious deaths. Hyland looked up from his tablet. But they don't have direct evidence. No communications from you ordering specific actions. No financial trails leading to your accounts. Everything runs through shell corporations and intermediaries. Blackwell stood at his window, watching morning sun turn the Pacific into hammered gold. The Chen property? Federal Protective Detail as of 6 hours ago. She's untouchable now. The seal. Cross. Being interviewed as a witness. Clean record, decorated veteran, acted within reasonable force parameters defending property against active crime. They're treating him as a hero, not a suspect. Hyland paused. We could push back through his chain of command, claim he's unstable, suffering PTSD, that his actions were excessive, might discredit his testimony. Blackwell considered that attacking a veteran who'd stopped an arson attempt would play terribly publicly. The town already knew something was happening. Federal agents swarming a quiet coastal community, rumors spreading through coffee shops and grocery stores. Turning Cross into a villain would backfire spectacularly. No, different approach. We cooperate fully. I'm a concerned businessman, shocked to discover employees acted criminally without authorization. I terminated contracts with the Finches last month due to performance issues. I've never met Deputy Webb socially. Any financial irregularities in his accounts are his private affairs. As for Mrs. Chen, I made legitimate business offers that she declined, which is absolutely her right. Blackwell turned from the window. We present me as the victim here. Employees who exceeded authority, a veteran with good intentions but misguided assumptions, and my reputation caught in the middle. Hyland nodded slowly. It's plausible, but they'll dig. They'll interview other property owners from previous developments. They'll look for patterns. Let them look. They'll find successful negotiations where both parties benefited. They'll find that coastal development revitalized dying towns. They'll find that I'm a businessman who takes calculated risks in challenging markets. Blackwell smiled coldly. What they won't find is proof, because I've never been stupid enough to create proof. What Blackwell didn't know was that Elena Vasquez had spent 18 months doing exactly what he'd assumed no one would bother with. Documenting patterns, interviewing previous victims, building timelines that showed suspicious coincidences clustering around his developments. And 48 hours ago, she'd handed all of that research to someone who knew exactly what to do with it. Cross sat in a FBI field office conference room in Portland, having driven there with Kodiak at dawn. Special Agent Mackenzie had been thorough but fair in her interview, and now she reviewed the flash drive Elena had provided, cross-referencing it with federal databases and previous investigations that had closed due to lack of evidence or local law enforcement interference. This journalist, Vasquez, her work is impressive, obsessive but impressive. Mackenzie looked up from her laptop. She's documented 7 properties across 3 developments. 4 owners sold quickly after initial offers. 3 held out. Of those 3, 1 died in a house fire ruled electrical. 1 died in a hit-and-run that was never solved. The 3rd sold 1 week after the hit-and-run and left the state immediately. Correlation, Cross said, but hard to prove causation without testimony. Agreed, which is why we need the Finch brothers to flick. They're facing 15 years minimum on the arson conspiracy. If we can connect them to the previous incidents, offer reduced sentences for testimony about who ordered what, we might build a RICO case against the Blackwell's entire operation. Will they flip? Mackenzie leaned back, considering. Garrett might. He's older, smarter, understands the mathematics of cooperation. Cole's more loyal, more stupid, thinks keeping quiet protects him. But if Garrett goes first, Cole will panic and follow. She paused. The leverage is time. Right now, they're still hoping Blackwell's lawyers will save them. Give them 72 hours in federal holding, watching that hope die, and they'll start talking. What about Mrs. Chen? Is she safe? For now. We've got protective detail on her property, and she's been instructed not to be alone anywhere. But Cross, I need you to understand something. Mething, if this goes to trial, it could take months or years. Federal cases against wealthy defendants with sophisticated legal teams drag. During that time, Blackwell remains free, and desperate men do desperate things. Cross had considered that reality, had spent the 3-hour drive to Portland gaming out scenarios, tactical problems, and solutions. He'll try to make the problem go away differently, discredit witnesses, settle civil suits. Use political pressure to slow the investigation. Exactly, which is why we need to move fast and build an airtight case before he has time to maneuver. Mackenzie closed her laptop. You did good work, petty officer. Legitimately heroic. But from here, it's federal procedure and legal process. I need you to step back, return to your leave, and let us handle this. Cross nodded, knowing she was right, knowing that his part was over. He'd stopped the immediate threat, created the opening for justice to function. The rest wasn't his fight. Except he didn't believe it would be that simple. He was might. Blackwell made his move 36 hours later, not through violence or intimidation, but through the systems he'd spent decades learning to manipulate. His lawyers filed motions questioning the validity of Cross's citizen's arrest, claiming excessive force, improper detention, and violation of the suspect's civil rights. They submitted affidavits from character witnesses describing the Finch brothers as good men who'd never been violent. They provided employment records showing Blackwell had terminated their contracts weeks before the incident, establishing no connection. Simultaneously, Blackwell's political connections activated. A state senator who'd received substantial campaign contributions called the FBI field office director, expressing concern about federal overreach in local matters. A newspaper owned by a corporation that did business with Blackwell published an editorial questioning whether a PTSD-suffering veteran should be celebrated for violent confrontation with unarmed contractors. The pressure was subtle but real. Not enough to stop the investigation, but enough to slow it, to introduce doubt, to transform a clear case of criminal conspiracy into something murkier and more complicated. Mrs. Chen felt it first. Friends who'd been supportive suddenly became distant. Neighbors who'd expressed outrage about her treatment now avoided eye contact. The mayor's office called, suggesting that perhaps accepting Blackwell's next offer might be in everyone's best interest, given the disruption the federal investigation was causing. She called Cross, voice shaking. They're still winning. Even with the FBI here, with those men arrested, Blackwell is still winning, because he has money and power and I just have. You have the truth, and you're not alone. But Cross understood her fear. He'd seen this pattern in other contexts, in countries where corruption had metastasized so deeply that removing one tumor just revealed 10 others. The difference was that in those places, he'd operated with legal immunity and lethal authority. Here, he was bound by laws designed to protect the innocent, but exploited by the guilty. Elena appeared at his cabin that evening, laptop in hand, face determined. I've been going through financial records, public ones, property transactions, business filings. Blackwell's sophisticated, but he's also arrogant. He's been using the same shell corporation structure for 15 years, just changing names. I can trace the pattern. Cross looked at her research, seeing what she saw. Limited liability companies created, used for single transactions, then dissolved. But the registered agents were the same. The formation addresses were the same. The banks were the same. A pattern that repeated across dozens of properties, including 2 where owners had died suspiciously. This is good work. Give it to Mackenzie. I already did. She says it's compelling but circumstantial. She needs testimony connecting Blackwell to specific criminal acts. She needs the Finch brothers to talk. Elena met his eyes. They're being arraigned tomorrow. Bail hearing. Blackwell's lawyers are pushing for release pending trial. If they make bail, they disappear. Or they have accidents. Or they get intimidated into silence. Elena's voice carried frustration and fear. We're so close, but the system is designed to give every advantage to people like Blackwell. Money buys lawyers who know how to exploit every technicality, who can delay and deflect and drag things out until witnesses give up or disappear. Cross sat in silence, feeling the old, familiar rage at injustice, at systems that protected predators while victims suffered. He'd become a SEAL partly because military justice was cleaner, simpler. Enemy combatants didn't get bail hearings. They got neutralized, and the world became marginally safer. But this wasn't a war zone. These weren't enemy combatants. This was America, where laws mattered, where process mattered, where his personal sense of justice had to bend to constitutional protections, even when those protections were being weaponized by the guilty. Kodiak rested his head on Cross's knee, amber eyes reflecting firelight from the wood stove. The dog sensed his handler's turmoil, offering comfort without judgment, loyalty without condition. Cross made a decision. The arraignment is in Portland? Federal courthouse, 1000 tomorrow. I'll be there. Elena studied him. Why? You can't do anything. It's a legal proceeding. I can watch. I can let the Finch brothers see me watching. Let them understand that if they walk out of that courthouse on bail, if they disappear or have sudden memory problems, someone will be paying attention. Someone who's very good at finding people who don't want to be found. That's intimidation. That's presence. I won't threaten them, won't approach them. I'll just be there. In uniform. Elena's eyes widened. Your dress uniform? Full honors. Every ribbon, every decoration, every visual reminder that I represent something bigger than Blackwell's money. That there are still people who serve honor over profit, who can't be bought or scared or made to look away. It was psychological warfare, not illegal, not violent, but unmistakably communicative. Cross would attend a public proceeding in proper military dress, sitting where the defendants could see him, representing not threat but accountability, reminding them that their choice wasn't between Blackwell's lawyers and federal prosecutors. It was between integrity and corruption, between truth and complicity. And sometimes, when everything else was balanced on a knife edge, psychology tipped the scales. The next morning, Cross drove to Portland, wearing his Navy service dress blue uniform. He'd maintained it carefully even during leave, the dark navy jacket and trousers pressed to regulation standards, gold buttons polished, ribbons arranged in perfect order above his left breast pocket. The Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal with Combat V, the Joint Service Commendation Medal, Afghanistan Campaign Medal, Iraq Campaign Medal. Others that represented years of service in places whose names remained classified. On his right chest, the gold trident. Naval Special Warfare insignia, the symbol that communicated to anyone who understood military culture exactly what he was, exactly what he'd done, exactly what he represented. Kodiak couldn't accompany him into the courthouse, so Cross left him in the truck with windows down and water, promising to return soon. The shepherd watched him go with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand this was a different kind of mission, one that required different weapons. The federal courthouse was modern glass and steel, security rigorous but professional. Cross passed through metal detectors, presented his military ID, and made his way to the courtroom where the Finch brothers housed. Arraignment was scheduled. He took a seat in the gallery, third row center, where he'd be visible to defendants and attorneys but not disruptive. Other spectators filed in. Blackwell's legal team, 3 attorneys in expensive suits carrying leather briefcases. Elena, sitting near the bat with her laptop. Mrs. Chen, small and dignified in a simple dress, her presence a quiet act of courage. And others, townspeople from Willow Creek who'd made the drive, who'd decided that maybe silence was no longer acceptable. When the Finch brothers were led in wearing orange jumpsuits and restraints, their eyes scanned the room automatically. Saw their lawyers, saw Blackwell's team, saw the small crowd. Then saw Cross. Garrett Finch stopped moving for just a moment, recognition and comprehension washing over his face. He saw the uniform, the ribbons, the trident, and understood the message. This wasn't over. This wasn't going away. That SEAL who'd stopped then, who'd documented everything, who'd set this entire collapse in motion, was here, watching, remembering, promising without words that justice would be pursued whether they cooperated or not. Cole saw him too, and his bravado cracked visibly. He leaned toward his brother, whispered something urgent. Garrett just nodded slowly, his face settling into resignation. The arraignment proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency, charges read. Plea of not guilty entered, bail arguments presented. Blackwell's lawyers argued for reasonable bail, citing community ties and lack of flight risk. Federal prosecutors argued for remand, citing severity of charges and risk of witness intimidation. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and no apparent patience for nonsense, listened to both sides and rendered her decision. Remand, bail denied. Trial date to be set within 90 days per Speedy Trial Act. Defendants will remain in federal custody pending trial. Blackwell's attorneys objected, requested reconsideration, and were politely denied. The Finch brothers were led away, and just before the door closed, Garrett looked back one final time at Cross. What passed between them wasn't spoken, but was perfectly clear. Garrett had done the math. 72 more hours in federal holding, then a decision. Protect Blackwell and face 15 years. Or cooperate and maybe see daylight before his 60s. Cross stood as the courtroom emptied, buttoned his uniform jacket, and walked out into Portland sunshine. Elena caught up with him on the courthouse steps. That was powerful. Watching you in there, what you represented, I saw their faces change. Psychology matters. Will they flip? Garrett will. Within 3 days. He's smart enough to understand the only path to a shorter sentence is cooperation, and once he flips, Cole follows or faces everything alone. Mrs. Chen appeared, tears in her eyes, but standing straighter than Cross had seen her. Thank you, for being there, for not letting them think this was over. Cross looked at this small, elderly woman who'd refused to be broken, who'd stood firm when standing firm meant losing everything, and felt something shift in his chest. He'd come to Oregon to escape purpose, to decompress from years of mission-focused existence. To find peace in isolation. Instead, he'd found purpose of a different kind. Not clear-cut military objectives, but messy civilian justice. Not enemies to neutralize, but people to protect. Not simple solutions, but complicated persistence. Mrs. Chen, this isn't finished. Blackwell still walks free. The investigation will take time. Are you prepared for that? She smiled, small but genuine. Mr. Cross, I'm 68 years old. I spent 42 years married to a good man, 30 years teaching art to teenagers who mostly didn't appreciate it, and the last 14 months learning to live alone in a house full of memories. I've survived cancer diagnoses, budget cuts, and grief that felt like drowning. I can survive Harrison Blackwell and his lawyers. Cross believed her, and in that moment, understood something Chief Rivera had tried to explain during his exit interview at Balboa Naval Medical Center. That strength wasn't just physical capability or tactical proficiency. That courage wasn't just facing enemy fire. That honor meant standing up even when standing up was legally complicated and personally costly and offered no clear path to victory. Mrs. Chen was demonstrating all of that, and Cross was learning that maybe decompression didn't mean isolation. Maybe healing meant finding new missions. Maybe peace came not from avoiding conflict, but from choosing the right conflicts to fight. 3 days later, exactly as Cross predicted, Garrett Finch requested a meeting with federal prosecutors. He was prepared to provide testimony about direct orders from Harrison Blackwell, financial transactions, previous incidents involving intimidation, and potential involvement in the house fire and hit-and-run that had killed previous property owners. In exchange, he wanted a plea deal, 10 years reduced to 4, possibility of parole after 2 with good behavior and continued cooperation. Special Agent Mackenzie called Cross with the news. He's talking. Everything we needed and more. Cole's lawyer is already reaching out about a similar deal. And with their testimony, we can get warrants for Blackwell's communications, financial records, everything that's been protected until now. How long until arrest? 72 hours. We're building airtight case first. No mistakes, no technicalities for his lawyers to exploit. Cross disconnected and stood on Mrs. Chen's porch, watching Kodiak patrol the garden, watching the street where federal agents maintained their protective presence, watching a town slowly waking to the reality that power without accountability was ending. 72 hours, 3 more days. Then Harrison Blackwell would learn what Cross had learned in a dozen countries across 2 deployments. That eventually, inevitably, justice finds everyone. Even the rich, even the powerful, even those who believe money insulates them from consequences, especially them. Harrison Blackwell was arrested at 0600 on a Thursday morning, federal agents arriving with warrants for conspiracy to commit arson, witness intimidation, racketeering, etc., and accessory to 2 counts of negligent homicide connected to the previous suspicious deaths. They found him in his clifftop mansion, drinking coffee in a silk robe, watching the sunrise over the Pacific, as if this day were no different from any other day in a life built on the suffering of people too weak to fight back. His expression when they read his rights was almost admirable in its control. No panic, no outrage. Just cold calculation about how many hours before his lawyers had him released, and how much this inconvenience would cost to make disappear. But this wasn't local law enforcement he could manipulate. This wasn't a sheriff on his payroll, or a deputy who owed him for a boat. This was federal. All authority backed by testimony from his own operatives, financial records subpoenaed from shell corporations, and 18 months of investigative journalism documenting a pattern of predation spanning 3 coastal developments and 7 destroyed lives. Cross watched the arrest from a distance, parked on a public overlook a quarter-mile from Blackwell's estate, Kodiak in the passenger seat. He didn't need to be closer. Didn't need the satisfaction of seeing Blackwell in handcuffs personally. What mattered was that justice was moving, that systems designed to protect the innocent were finally functioning, that the wealthy predator who'd believed himself untouchable was learning differently. His phone buzzed. Special Agent Mackenzie. It's done. He's in custody. Bail hearing this afternoon. But with the charges we're filing and the evidence we have, I'm confident the judge will remand. Good. Cross, I wanted you to know. The testimony from the Finch brothers connected Blackwell to both previous deaths. The house fire wasn't electrical failure. It was deliberate. The hit and run wasn't random. It was contracted. We have dates, payments, communications. We can prove he ordered those killings to clear property acquisitions. Cross felt something cold and satisfied settle in his chest. Murder charges. 2 counts. Felony murder during commission of arson and conspiracy to commit murder. He's looking at life without parole if convicted. His lawyers will fight. They'll drag this out. But the evidence is solid. We have him. After disconnecting, Cross sat there watching the Pacific turn from gray to blue as morning sun gained strength. He thought about the 2 people who died because they'd refused to surrender their homes to a man who believed wealth granted him the right to take whatever he wanted. Thought about Mrs. Chen, who would have been the 3rd victim if an old dog's stubbornness and a stranger's intervention hadn't disrupted Blackwell's pattern. Thought about how many other Harrison Blackwells existed in how many other small towns, operating just inside legal boundaries. Exploiting systems designed to protect property rights and due process, destroying lives with paperwork and intimidation, and occasional violence disguised as accident. You couldn't fight them all, couldn't save everyone, but you could save someone, could stand up when standing up mattered, could refuse to look away when looking away was easier. That had to count for something. Mrs. Chen heard the news an hour later, standing in her kitchen with Elena. Both women watching morning television coverage of Blackwell's arrest. The local news showed footage of him being led from his mansion, expensive casual clothes replaced by standard issue, hands secured, federal agents flanking. His face remained composed, but his eyes carried something they'd never shown publicly before. Fear. Mrs. Chen sat down slowly, one hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming. Not tears of joy exactly, but of relief so profound it manifested physically. 14 months of grief, 6 months of escalating threats, weeks of terror culminating in her dog's poisoning and her home's violation, all of it crashing down at once now that the threat was finally neutralized. Elena embraced her, and the 2 women held each other, while the news anchor described charges and potential sentences, while legal analysts discussed the case's implications, while Willow Creek's shame was broadcast to the wider world. Cross arrived at noon, finding them in the garden where Mrs. Chen was attempting to salvage plants that hadn't been completely destroyed by the chemical poisoning. Some of the roses could be saved with aggressive pruning. The vegetables were mostly lost, but the beds themselves were intact. Soil could be remediated, new plants could grow. It's not destroyed, Mrs. Chen said, seeing him approach. Damaged, but not destroyed. William always said Ardens were lessons in resilience. Cut back what's dead, nourish what remains. Wait for spring. There's always spring. Cross helped her work, using pruning shears under her direction, learning which cuts promoted healing and which caused more harm. Kodiak lay nearby in shade, watchful but relaxed, understanding that the mission had shifted from protection to recovery. They worked in comfortable silence for an hour before Mrs. Chen spoke again. "I want to show you something." She led him to the memorial bench beneath the Japanese maple. The brass plaque cross had noticed his first day, but never read closely. It said, "William Chen, 1952 to 2023. He taught me that growing beautiful things in difficult soil is the highest form of hope." He had cancer for 18 months, fought hard, stayed positive, kept working these gardens even when he could barely stand. Said every flower he planted was an act of faith that someone would be here to see it bloom. She touched the plaque gently. "After he died, I thought about selling. The house was too big, the garden too much work, the memories too painful. But then I'd come out here and see what he built, and I'd think about him choosing hope even when dying, and I'd understand I couldn't abandon that. That's why you wouldn't sell. That's why I couldn't. This isn't just property. It's testament. It's proof that beauty and kindness and patience create something that survives us. Blackwell wanted to pave this over, build vacation condos, turn 42 years of love into profit margin." She looked up at Cross. "You stopped him, not just from taking my home, but from erasing William's hope." Cross didn't know what to say to that. He'd acted on instinct and training, on fundamental inability to ignore injustice when confronted directly. He hadn't been thinking about hope or legacy or any meaning beyond immediate tactical necessity. But maybe that was the point. Maybe heroism wasn't grand strategy and philosophical clarity. Maybe it was just showing up when someone needed help, doing what you were trained to do, refusing to walk away when walking away was simpler. "Your grandson," Mrs. Chen said. "The title of this story calls you that. But I never had children. William and I tried, couldn't. Eventually made peace with it. We had students instead, hundreds of them, and we told ourselves that was enough family." Cross understood immediately. Elena's article, the one she'd been writing throughout this ordeal, documenting everything. She'd titled it, "Rich Neighbors Poisoned a Widow's Garden and Her Old Dog," not knowing her grandson was a Navy SEAL. Creative license, transforming stranger into family, making the narrative more immediate and emotional. "It's metaphorically true," Elena said, emerging from the house with laptop and camera. "Maybe not biologically, but in every way that matters. You protected her like family, fought for her like family, risked everything like family would." Mrs. Chen nodded. "I'd be honored if you'd accept the title. Honorary grandson. No obligations, no expectations. Just acknowledgement that sometimes family is chosen, not born, and you chose to be mine when I needed someone most." Cross felt something in his chest. Some barrier he'd maintained between himself and emotional connection cracked slightly. He'd spent years in teams, brotherhood forged in combat, loyalty absolute but also temporary. Deployments ended, teams rotated, people moved on. He'd never had family beyond professional relationships and the dog at his side. Now an elderly widow he'd known less than 2 weeks was offering connection based not on blood but on shared values, on mutual recognition of what mattered, on the simple fact that he'd stood up when she'd needed someone to stand. "I'd be honored, Mrs. Chen." "Maggie, please. Family uses first names." "Maggie." She smiled, genuine and warm. Grief and fear finally beginning to recede enough that joy could find space to exist again. The bail hearing that afternoon went exactly as Special Agent Mackenzie had predicted. Federal prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of flight risk, danger to witnesses, and severity of charges. Blackwell's lawyers argued passionately about presumption of innocence and constitutional rights and their clients' deep ties to the community. The judge took 14 minutes to render decision. Remand without bail pending trial. Harrison Blackwell, who'd spent 52 years believing wealth insulated him from consequence, was transferred to federal detention to await trial that would likely end with life imprisonment. News spread through Willow Creek like fire through dry brush. The man who'd controlled their economy, influenced their politics, and intimidated their citizens for 5 years was gone. The deputies he'd paid were under investigation. The sheriff who'd looked the other way was facing recall election. The town council members who'd voted his interests were suddenly discovering principles they'd previously misplaced. Other victims began emerging. Property owners who'd sold under pressure, business owners who'd been forced out, people who'd lived with fear and silence because speaking meant retaliation. Now they spoke, Now they filed complaints. Now they provided testimony that would ensure every person in Blackwell's network faced appropriate legal consequences. It was cathartic and ugly and necessary. The infection being drawn from a wound that had festered too long. Cross spent the next week helping Maggie restore her garden, learning from her the patience and skill required to heal living things damaged by violence. He learned proper pruning techniques, soil remediation, pest management, learned that growing beauty required knowledge and dedication and willingness to work with natural processes rather than against them. Kodiak seemed to understand they were staying longer than originally planned. The shepherd established new routines, patrolling the property each morning, accompanying Maggie on slow walks through the neighborhood, accepting treats from her with dignity that suggested he considered her pack now. Rex came home on day 9, thinner and weak but alive. The old border collie mix moved carefully, his body still recovering from poison that should have killed him. But his eyes were bright and his tail wagged when he saw Maggie. She knelt beside him, buried her face in his fur, and wept with gratitude that her companion of 14 years had survived. The two dogs regarded each other with the mutual respect of warriors who'd both served, both survived, both understood that some bonds transcended species or training or circumstance. Rex was too old and weak to play, but he'd sit in the garden while Kodiak patrolled, two sentinels of different generations sharing space companionably. Elena's article published in a regional newspaper, then got picked up nationally, then went viral online. The story of an elderly widow terrorized by a corrupt developer, saved by a Navy SEAL who happened to be renting a cabin nearby, resonated deeply. It touched something fundamental about justice, about standing up for the vulnerable, about the idea that sometimes the right person appears at the right moment. Interview requests flooded in. National news programs wanted Cross on camera. Publishers wanted book deals. Hollywood producers smelled adaptation potential. Cross declined everything. He'd acted because action was necessary, not for recognition or profit. His story wasn't public entertainment. It was private commitment to principles that didn't require audience validation, but he did agree to one interview with Elena for her follow-up article. They sat on Maggie's porch while late spring turned toward summer, Kodiak at his feet, Rex on a cushioned bed nearby. "Why did you really get involved?" Elena asked. "The first time, when you saw Maggie being threatened, you drove away. What changed?" Cross considered the question carefully. "I came here to escape, to decompress, to stop being a weapon and learn how to be a person again. I thought that meant isolation, separation from conflict and purpose. But that night, listening to her dog in distress, I realized something. Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's knowing which conflicts matter and having the courage to engage them. And this mattered. This mattered. She mattered. The principle that wealth doesn't grant immunity from decency mattered." He paused. "I've spent 10 years serving my country in places most Americans will never hear about, doing things I can't discuss. I believed that was where honor lived, in classified operations and strategic objectives. But watching Maggie stand up to Blackwell with nothing but dignity and refusal to surrender her husband's legacy taught me that courage exists everywhere, that sometimes the most important battles happen in garden disputes and property rights and old women who won't be broken." Elena typed rapidly, capturing his words. "What happens now? You've got 2 more months of medical leave. I'll stay here, help Maggie finish restoring the garden, make sure the protective detail transitions smoothly, testify at trial when it comes." Cross looked at the garden, seeing William's hope made manifest in careful plantings and stone pathways. "Then I'll return to my team, but I'll come back, check in, make sure she's okay." "Family does that," Elena observed. "Family does that." As sunset painted the sky orange and gold, Maggie brought out tea and cookies, settling into her chair with the contentment of someone finally safe in her own home. They sat together, the widow, the journalist, the warrior, and 2 dogs who'd both survived poisoning through stubbornness and loyalty. Cross's phone buzzed. Chief Rivera, checking in as he did weekly. "How's decompression going?" Cross looked at Maggie, laughing at something. Elena said, "At her garden slowly healing. At the town visible in the distance, beginning its own recovery. Better than expected, Chief. Much better. Good, you sound different, lighter. Maybe I am. After disconnecting, Cross remained on the porch as darkness gathered and stars emerged. Kodiak's head rested on his knee, warm and solid and constant. In the distance, ocean waves provided rhythmic accompaniment to evening sounds. Running from purpose he thought had consumed him. He'd found something different. Found that purpose wasn't burden, but gift. Found that family could be chosen. Found that peace came not from avoiding conflict, but from engaging the right ones, standing for the right people, refusing to look away when looking away was easier. Harrison Blackwell would face trial in 4 months, would likely spend the rest of his life in federal prison. His empire was collapsing, properties being sold, victims receiving restitution, corruption being systematically dismantled. And in a small house with a healing garden, an elderly widow slept safely for the first time in months, protected by systems that finally worked and by an honorary grandson who taught her that sometimes hope calls for reinforcements and reinforcements answer. The mission was complete. Justice was moving. The vulnerable were protected. But Cross understood now that the mission was never really complete, that there would always be another Harrison Blackwell, another person who needed standing up for, another battle worth fighting. And when that call came, when purpose needed him again, he'd answer. Because that's what family did. That's what honor demanded. That's what SEALs were trained for. Protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Standing against those who believed cower insulated them from justice. One garden at a time, one widow at a time, one corrupt developer at a time. Until eventually, incrementally, the world became slightly less cruel and slightly more just. That was the mission. That was always the mission. And Ethan Cross would serve it until his last breath, with Kodiak at his side and honor as his compass. Always. 3 months later, Cross stood in the arrivals terminal at Portland International Airport, watching his team filter through the crowd. They'd come for the trial, to support one of their own, to see the man who'd spent 10 years as their breacher, their brother, their constant, testify in civilian court about events that had nothing to do with classified operations, but everything to do with the values they all served. Chief Rivera emerged first, graying hair and weathered face breaking into a rare smile. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Ortiz followed, their platoon officer, carrying herself with the quiet authority that made her exceptional at leading exceptional men. Then the rest, 6 operators who'd shared more danger than most people experienced in lifetimes, who understood that the bond forged in combat transcended time and distance. They descended on Cross like a wave, handshakes becoming embraces, professional discipline giving way to genuine affection. Kodiak greeted each of them, tail wagging, receiving the attention due a team member who'd served as faithfully as any human. "You look good, Cross," Rivera said, studying him with the assessing eye of someone who'd spent 20 years reading men under pressure. "Better than when you left. Oregon agrees with me. Or something here does." Ortiz smiled knowingly. "We heard about your adventures. SEALs can't even take medical leave without finding a mission." They drove to Willow Creek in a convoy of rental vehicles, the team curious to see this town that had become significant in Cross's life. He'd told them the essential facts over secure communications, but facts didn't convey atmosphere, didn't explain why this place and these people mattered enough that he'd extended his leave twice and was already planning to return after redeployment. Maggie had prepared for their arrival with the focused energy of someone who understood hospitality as love made tangible. Her house overflowed with food. The garden had been transformed into an outdoor reception space with tables and chairs borrowed from neighbors, and she'd recruited half the town to help welcome the men and women who'd served with her honorary grandson. The reunion was chaotic and joyful, military formality dissolving into something warmer as operators met the civilians they'd heard about but never expected to encounter. Rivera spent an hour talking with Maggie about gardening, discovering unexpected common ground between special operations leadership and cultivating roses. Ortiz interviewed Elena about her investigative journalism, professional curiosity about how civilians pursued truth without weapons or authority. Rex and Kodiak held court in the garden, the old border collie accepting attention with dignity while the German shepherd maintained alert vigilance even during celebration. The two dogs had become inseparable. Rex's final years enriched by the younger dog's protective presence, Kodiak learning from Rex that service took many forms and all of them mattered. As evening settled, Cross found himself standing with Rivera at the garden's edge, watching his team integrate with his new life in ways that felt surprisingly natural. "You're not coming back, are you?" Rivera's tone carried no judgment, just recognition. Cross considered lying, then remembered this man had known him for 6 years and earned honesty. "Not permanently. I'll finish my enlistment, honor my commitment. But after that, I think I'm done." "Why?" "Because I came here broken, Chief. Kandahar broke something, made me forget why we do what we do, made me think I was just a weapon, that violence was my only purpose." Cross gestured at the garden, at Maggie laughing with Ortiz, at the town visible in the distance. "This reminded me, showed me that our skills, our training, our willingness to stand in harm's way, it's all in service of this. Normal people living normal lives, growing gardens, raising families, existing without fear. That's what we protect. That's what matters." Rivera nodded slowly. "And you can protect it better from here than from a team room in Virginia Beach." "I can protect it differently. There are Harrison Blackwells everywhere, Chief. Men who use wealth and influence to exploit the vulnerable, who operate just inside legal boundaries, who destroy lives because they can. They're not enemy combatants, can't be neutralized with direct action, but they're threats just the same. And someone needs to stand against them. Vigilante justice? Legal intervention, investigation, documentation, working with federal authorities, providing security for people who can't afford it." Cross met Rivera's eyes. "Using everything the Navy taught me, but in service of domestic threats that don't qualify for military response." Rivera was quiet for a long moment, watching the celebration, processing what Cross was saying. "You're talking about private security, investigative work, maybe bounty hunting. I'm talking about standing up for people like Maggie, like the 2 property owners who died before I got here, like the hundreds of others across the country facing similar predation." Cross paused. "The skills we have, they're wasted once we're out if we don't apply them to something meaningful. I want to apply them where they matter most. You'll need resources, funding, legal framework. Elena's already working on it. We're establishing a nonprofit, Pacific Coastal Justice Initiative, providing free investigative and security services to vulnerable populations facing exploitation. She handles research and publicity. I handle security and tactical planning. We've got lawyers volunteering, former law enforcement offering consultation, community activists providing local knowledge." Rivera smiled, slow and genuine. "You built a team. I learned from the best." The trial began 2 days later in Portland's federal courthouse. Harrison Blackwell facing 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, 1 count of racketeering, 3 counts of witness intimidation, and multiple related charges that collectively guaranteed life imprisonment if convicted on even half of them. His legal team was formidable, expensive suits and rehearsed arguments, and every procedural tactic money could buy. But federal prosecutors had spent 3 months building an airtight case, and the Finch brothers' testimony provided direct connection between Blackwell's orders and criminal acts spanning 15 years. Cross testified on day 3, wearing his service dress blue uniform, every ribbon polished, every detail regulation perfect. He recounted events with precision and clarity, describing the poisoning he'd discovered, the break-in he'd documented, the arson attempt he'd stopped, the evidence he'd collected and preserved. Blackwell's lawyers tried to shake him during cross-examination, suggesting PTSD had influenced his judgment, implying his actions constituted vigilantism rather than legal citizen's arrest. Questioning whether a trained killer could objectively assess civilian situations, Cross remained calm, answers brief and factual, never rising to emotional manipulation. He'd been trained for interrogation resistance, had endured far more sophisticated psychological pressure in environments where failure meant death. Corporate lawyers playing courtroom games were amateur hour. When they implied his relationship with Mrs. Chen created bias that undermined his testimony, Cross's response was simple and devastating. "My relationship with Mrs. Chen is grandson to grandmother. She's a 68-year-old widow who refused to surrender her home, to a man who believed wealth granted him the right to take it. I acted to protect her because that's what family does. That's what honor demands. And that's what this country stands for when it remembers what it's supposed to be. The gallery erupted in applause. The judge gavelled for order, but couldn't quite hide her smile. Maggie testified on day 5, small and dignified on the witness stand, describing 14 months of escalating terror, the loss of her husband to cancer, the destruction of gardens that represented 42 years of love and partnership, the poisoning of her dog, the violation of her home. She spoke without dramatics, without embellishment, just truth delivered in the calm voice of someone who'd survived and refused to be ashamed of her survival. When prosecution asked why she hadn't accepted Blackwell's offers and avoided all this suffering, her answer was immediate. Because my husband taught me that growing beautiful things in difficult soil is the highest form of hope. Surrendering that hope to someone who wanted to pave it over for profit would have been surrendering everything William and I built together. Everything we believed about choosing beauty over convenience, about standing firm on principle, about refusing to let cruelty win simply because cruelty is powerful. She looked directly at Blackwell. He wanted me to break. I didn't, and I never will. A jury deliberated for 7 hours, guilty on all counts. Blackwell's face remained composed as the verdict was read, but his hands shook slightly, control finally cracking. The judge scheduled sentencing for 30 days later. Remand continued, and Harrison Blackwell was led from the courtroom in restraints. Empire collapsed, immunity shattered, the future stretching ahead as decades in federal prison, where wealth meant nothing and power was distributed according to entirely different metrics. Outside the courthouse, Maggie stood surrounded by supporters, by other victims who'd found courage in her example, by a community learning to reclaim itself from corruption. News cameras captured her statement, small woman with steel spine delivering message that would resonate far beyond Willow Creek. Justice took time, but it came. Not because the system worked perfectly, but because people refused to stop pushing until it worked. My honorary grandson started that process. Federal investigators continued it. All of you supported it. And today we proved that wealth doesn't grant immunity, that power has limits, that ordinary people standing together are stronger than extraordinary people standing alone. Cross stood to the side, uncomfortable with attention, letting Maggie have her moment. This was her victory, her vindication, her proof that choosing hope over fear had been right, even when it seemed impossibly dangerous. Rivera approached, handed him a beer that somehow materialized despite being outside a federal courthouse. To mission success. They touched bottles, drank, watched the celebration unfold. Cross's team had attended every day of trial, sitting in the gallery in civilian clothes, silent support for their brother, navigating challenges that had nothing to do with combat, but everything to do with the values combat supposedly defended. Command wants to know your plans, Rivera said after a moment. Re-enlistment window opens in 4 months. I'm not re-enlisting. Figured. They'll be disappointed. You're one of the best breachers we've had. I'll miss it. Miss the team. Miss the clarity. Cross watched Maggie embracing Elena, both women crying and laughing simultaneously. But this matters more. There are fights here that need fighting. People who need protecting. And I've got skills that are wasted if I don't apply them where they matter most. Rivera nodded acceptance. You'll stay in touch. You'll remember you've got brothers who answer when called. Always, Chief, always. Sentencing came 4 weeks later. The judge delivered her decision with the weight of someone who understood the significance beyond this individual case, who recognized that Blackwell represented a pattern of exploitation that required clear deterrent. Life imprisonment without possibility of parole on the murder conspiracy charges. Additional consecutive sentences on the other counts, symbolic since life already meant life, but important for establishing the full scope of his crimes. Blackwell was 62 years old. He would die in federal prison. His wealth would be distributed among victims through civil suits. His properties would be sold. His name would become cautionary tale about the limits of money and the eventual triumph of justice when systems finally functioned as designed. Cross wasn't present for sentencing. He was in Maggie's garden, helping her plant new roses to replace those killed by chemical poisoning, learning that restoration took longer than destruction, but produced results that endured. Rex supervised from his cushioned bed. Kodiak ranged the perimeter. An afternoon sun turned everything gold. Maggie's phone buzzed with the news. She read it, smiled, set it aside, returned to planting. It's over. Yes. He'll die in prison. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, hands in soil, performing the ritual William had taught her decades ago. I don't feel victorious. I feel tired, relieved, but mostly tired. That's normal. You've been fighting for a long time. We've been fighting. You, Elena, the FBI, my neighbors who finally found courage. I didn't do this alone. No, but you started it. Refused to give up when giving up was easier. That gave the rest of us something to protect, something to fight for. Maggie planted the rose carefully, patted soil around its base, watered it gently. William would have liked you, would have appreciated that you understood about gardens, about growing things, about standing firm. I would have liked to meet him. You did, in a way. Everything here is him. Every plant, every stone, every choice to create beauty instead of surrender to convenience. You protected his legacy. You protected his hope. She looked up, eyes bright with tears that weren't quite sadness. Thank you, Ethan, for everything. Cross knelt beside her, this woman who'd become family through shared crisis and mutual recognition of what mattered, and felt something settle in his chest. Purpose rediscovered. Discovered, mission clarified, peace achieved not through isolation but through connection, through standing up when standing up was necessary, through using skills honed in violence to prevent violence before it could flourish. Thank you, Maggie, for teaching me that courage takes many forms, that hope is action, that family is chosen, that growing beautiful things in difficult soil is the highest form of resistance against people who want to pave the world for profit. They finished planting as afternoon became evening, two people rebuilding beauty in soil that had been poisoned, creating something that would outlast both of them, testament to the idea that destruction is temporary, but careful cultivation endures. 6 months later, Cross stood in the same Portland terminal where he'd greeted his team, this time saying goodbye. His enlistment was complete, terminal leave exhausted, transition to civilian life officially begun. The Navy offered re-enlistment bonuses, promises of promotion, appeals to continue serving. He declined with gratitude and certainty. Kodiak was officially retired from service, transitioned to civilian life alongside his handler, partnership continuing beyond military structure into whatever came next. The shepherd accepted this change with the adaptability that made him excellent at his job. Understanding that protecting people was the mission regardless of uniform or authority structure. Rivera accompanied him through the airport, final gesture of respect from command to operator, completing his service. They stood at the security checkpoint, moment of farewell that neither wanted to acknowledge directly. The Pacific Coastal Justice Initiative is operational? Rivera asked. Launched 2 weeks ago, 15 cases already. Mostly involving predatory lending and real estate exploitation. Elena handles investigation and publicity. I handle security and tactical planning. We've got retired FBI agents consulting, lawyers providing pro bono work, community organizations identifying victims who need help. Sounds like you built something real. Trying to. Maggie's house serves as headquarters. Her garden hosts community meetings. She's become the face of the organization. Proves that resisting exploitation is possible, that standing up matters. Cross paused. We're getting calls from other coastal towns, other vulnerable populations. People who watched the Blackwell trial and realized they didn't have to accept predation as inevitable. Rivera extended his hand. Cross took it, handshake becoming embrace. Final goodbye between warriors who'd shared more than most brothers ever would. Fair winds, Cross. You were one of the best. Thank you for everything, Chief. For training me, for trusting me, for showing me that leadership means caring about your people beyond their tactical utility. That's what teams do. Cross moved through security with Kodiak, transitioned from military operator to civilian with expertise, from weapon that needed permission to engage to free agent who chose his own battles. It felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Vast possibilities opening where previous structure had provided clear boundaries and defined purpose. But he'd learned something crucial these past months. That purpose didn't require external authority. that mission could be self-determined, that the skills developed through military service had applications far beyond sanctioned violence, could be wielded in defense of principles rather than just objectives, could create security for people who'd never qualify for official protection. Back in Willow Creek, Maggie waited in the garden with Rex, both of them grayer and slower, but alive, thriving, testament to resilience and the healing that comes from refusing to accept defeat. Elena worked inside, laptop open, documenting new cases, building networks, transforming individual victory into systematic support for others facing similar exploitation. Cross arrived at sunset, Kodiak immediately seeking out Rex, the two dogs greeting each other with affection that transcended the vast difference in their training and experience. Warriors both, protectors both, brothers in service, regardless of species or circumstance. "Welcome home," Maggie said, embracing him. Home. The word resonated differently than it ever had before. Not a place you came from, but a place you chose, people you protected, principles you served, regardless of convenience or compensation. This was home now. Willow Creek, Maggie's garden. The work of standing between the vulnerable and those who'd exploit them. The mission that never really ended, because predators never stopped hunting, and victims never stopped needing champions. But champions existed, would always exist, because some people couldn't ignore injustice, even when ignoring it was easier. Couldn't walk away from people who needed help, even when walking away was safer. Couldn't surrender principles, even when surrender was more profitable. Ethan Frost was one of those people, had been forged into that person through 10 years of military service, had been refined through Maggie's example and Willow Creek's crisis, had discovered that the best way to honor his training was applying it where bureaucracy and authority couldn't or wouldn't reach. He stood in the garden as stars emerged, Kodiak at his side, Maggie and Elena and Rex nearby, the town visible in the distance, where lights flickered on and life continued in the safety they'd fought to establish. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new victims, new predators who needed stopping. The work would never be complete because human cruelty was infinite and justice required constant vigilance. But tonight, in this moment, there was peace. Hard-won, carefully maintained, fragile but real. And Cross understood that peace wasn't the absence of conflict. It was knowing you'd stood up when standing up mattered, protected those who needed protecting, refused to look away when looking away was easier. That was enough. That would always be enough. If this story touched your heart, if Maggie's courage inspired you, if you believe that standing up for the vulnerable matters, please share this story. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you would have done in Cross's position. Would you have helped? Would you have walked away? Would you have found the courage to choose hope over fear? Subscribe to hear more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, about courage in unexpected places, about the truth that evil flourishes when good people do nothing, but withers when even one person says enough. Remember, somewhere out there, someone is waiting for their champion. Someone is facing their Harrison Blackwell, feeling alone and powerless and terrified. Someone needs to know that standing up is possible, that resistance matters, that they're not alone. Be that champion, be that voice, be that person who refuses to look away. Because when duty calls, when justice needs defenders, when the vulnerable need protecting, heroes answer, not because they're extraordinary, but because they're ordinary people who choose to do what's right, even when it's hard, who stand firm, even when standing alone seems impossible, who prove every single day that one person willing to act can change everything. May you find your mission. May you serve with honor. May you always choose courage over convenience, principle over profit, and hope over fear. Until we meet again.